Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is honestly one of the most high-stakes, dramatic, and just plain fascinating legal frameworks in the entire world. We're going to dive into the rules governing maritime rescue operations. Specifically, we'll see how a centuries-old tradition literally had to evolve overnight to prevent catastrophic environmental disasters. So let's get into it.
I want you to picture this. A massive cargo ship, packed with thousands of tons of hazardous material, loses power right in the middle of a raging storm. It's drifting dangerously close to a rocky coastline. So, who actually goes out into that storm to save it? And maybe more importantly, how do those brave crews guarantee they get paid for taking on such an insane financial and physical risk? Well, the answer really isn't as simple as just handing over a paycheck. The system they use to solve this giant puzzle is an absolute masterclass in industry compromise. Here's our roadmap for the day. We're going to start with what is maritime salvage. Then we'll look at the environmental turning point, followed by the flaws in the safety net. After that, we'll cover the SCOPIC solution. And finally, wrap up with the special casualty representative. All right, part one. What is maritime salvage? Let's quickly establish the absolute baseline of how salvage at sea actually works, because I promise you, it's completely different from just towing a broken down car on the highway. First things first, we've got to define what's actually being saved here. Maritime property includes the vessel itself, the cargo, the freight, and yeah, nowadays even downed aircraft. But here's a really surprising, kind of counterintuitive reality of maritime law. Human life has zero financial price attached to it in this specific context. Because salvage funds are raised entirely based on the value of the property saved, you actually can't legally claim a financial reward just for saving a life. Now, don't worry, mariners are still legally and morally bound to rescue people in mortal danger, but in practice, human lives and maritime property are almost always saved together in the exact same operation. And, judges do tend to give higher awards when lives are saved alongside the ship. For a rescue to officially count as a salvage and actually earn a reward, it's got to hit 4 really strict principles. 1, it must involve maritime property. 2, it has to be entirely voluntary. That means harbor tugs doing their normal everyday jobs doesn't count. 3, the ship must be in real objective danger. It doesn't necessarily have to be sinking that very second, but it definitely needs outside help. And lastly, and honestly most importantly, the operation must be successful. Now, the absolute bedrock of this entire system relies on 4 words: no cure, no pay. Think about what that means. A salvage company can send out multi-million-dollar tugboats. They can risk their crews in hurricane-force winds. They can spend weeks sweating over a ship. And if that ship ultimately sinks, the salvers get absolutely nothing. Literally zero. This high-risk, high-reward system, well, it worked perfectly for centuries. It highly motivated salvers to succeed. But then the very nature of what these ships carried fundamentally changed. Which brings us to part 2, the environmental turning point. Let's look at how the rise of massive oil tankers totally upended those ancient rules of the sea. For decades, salvage was governed by the 1910 Convention, firmly rooted in that no cure, no pay tradition we just talked about. But by the late 20th century, ships were getting exponentially larger, and they were carrying millions of gallons of crude oil. Tracing this timeline to the 1980s and then the 1989 Salvage Convention, the industry woke up to a horrific new reality. Oil spills were just devastating coastlines left and right, and it turned out the old salvage laws were actually making the problem way worse. The crucial point here is what we can call a terrifying disincentive. Imagine you're a salvage master, okay? A massive oil tanker is on fire, it's leaking near a reef. Under no cure, no pay, if you spend millions trying to save it, but the fire destroys the ship anyway, you go bankrupt. You get nothing. So what do? Well, you might hesitate. You might negotiate instead of just acting immediately. Actually, you might not even try at all. And while you hesitate, the environment becomes the ultimate victim. The shipping industry realized they desperately needed a way to incentivize salvers to intervene, even when the chance of saving the physical ship was practically zero.
Okay, part 3, flaws in the safety net. To fix this terrifying disincentive, the industry tried to introduce a safety net. But as we'll see, it quickly led to a solid decade of legal headaches.
So the 1989 Salvage Convention created this 2-tier system. On one side, you had Article 13, which maintained the classic no cure, no pay reward based on the value of the property saved. But on the other side, Article 14 introduced the safety net. The idea was simple. If a salver tried to save a ship that threatened the environment, but failed to earn a big Article 13 reward, the ship's insurers, specifically the Protection and Indemnity, or P&I clubs,
would cover the salver's out-of-pocket expenses. They'd even toss in a bonus or an uplift if they actually prevented a spill. Sounds like a totally perfect fix, right?
Unfortunately, it really wasn't. Despite all the good intentions, Article 14 was deeply flawed. First off, salvers had to legally prove there was a concrete threat to the environment, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly hard to do in the absolute chaos of a storm. Second, it was restricted only to coastal or inland waters, so if you were further out to sea, poof, the safety net vanished. And then came the infamous Nagasaki Spirit case. After saving a burning ship carrying 40,000 tons of crude oil, courts ruled that salvers could only recover bare minimum expenses, no profit allowed. So suddenly, this so-called safety net was dragging everyone into years of hostile, ridiculously expensive arbitration. Which brings us to part 4, the SCOPIC solution. This was the ultimate radical fix to these massive industry problems. It stands for the Special Compensation P&I Club Clause, or just SCOPIC for short. The shipping industry, the insurers, and the salvers finally sat down at the table. They realized they needed certainty, not more lawsuits. So SCOPIC was born, and it was a really radical, adaptable compromise. Look at what it throws right out the window. You no longer have to prove an environmental threat to trigger it, and there are absolutely zero geographical limitations. None. It applies anywhere in the world, instantly. It basically swept away all those vague ambiguities of Article 14 and replaced them with cold, hard, reliable numbers.
SCOPIC completely transformed a dense legal argument into a highly actionable process. Here's how it works. Step 1. The solver invokes it at literally any time during the operation by simply declaring it, just like that. Step 2. The ship owner is then legally obligated to provide a staggering $3 million in security within just 2 working days. This completely cures the solver's cash flow anxiety. And step 3. Instead of fighting in court over what a tugboat costs, SCOPIC features a pre-agreed profitable tariff rate for time and materials, plus a guaranteed flat 25% bonus. Now, if the traditional no-cure, no-pay reward ends up being higher, they get that instead. But SCOPIC ensures that at the very least, if solvers put their lives and their gear on the line to prevent an ecological disaster, they are 100% guaranteed a profitable payday.
Moving on to part 5, the Special Casualty Representative. Let's see how on-the-ground casualty management was revolutionized right alongside those financial rules. Because the ship owners and their insurers were now guaranteeing millions of dollars up front under SCOPIC, you better believe they wanted eyes on the operation. Enter the Special Casualty Representative, or SCR. This is a highly vetted expert sent directly to the casualty scene. But here is the absolutely critical distinction. They are not there to take over. The SCR cannot direct the salvage master or order the tugs around. Nope. They are purely there to monitor the situation, keep a close track of costs, and provide an objective, perfectly neutral final salvage report.
See, before SCOPIC and the SCR, a shipwreck was essentially an information black hole. Salvers kept quiet to protect their negotiating position, insurers were completely terrified of unknown costs, and coastal governments were, naturally, panicking about oil spills. The SCR acts as the pivotal communication link. By providing daily, factual reports on the equipment being used and the progress being made, the SCR turns what could be a chaotic, adversarial disaster response into a truly transparent, collaborative operation. If the SCR happens to disagree with the salvage master's methods, they don't start a yelling match on the bridge. They simply note it formally in a dissenting report. It just keeps everyone's focus exactly where it should be, on saving the ship and protecting the sea.
There's a great quote from a leading Lloyd's underwriter that perfectly validates the journey we just took. They said, "SCOPIC has been a very worthwhile development. Salvers are responding to difficult casualties with greater confidence. The Special Casualty Representative has been a useful development. It proves that replacing a combative, litigation-heavy system with a transparent, structured framework actually brought trust back to the shipping industry. Property underwriters and P&I clubs, who, by the way, used to fight constantly over who should pay what, now have a reliable system, one that encourages a rapid response, protects the marine environment, and ensures salvers can confidently go out and do their incredibly dangerous jobs." I want to leave you with this final thought. SCOPIC was a total masterstroke of late 90s and early 2000s negotiation. It successfully balanced the ancient, romanticized traditions of salvage with very real, modern environmental realities. But as cargo ships continue to transform into literal floating megacities, and as the urgency to protect our oceans reaches an all-time high, we really have to ask ourselves, what will the future of maritime salvage demand of us next? Will the frameworks of today actually hold up to the colossal challenges of tomorrow? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the unseen systems that keep our world moving.